Hi, this is Jimmy Moyle with Headfirst Baseball. Wanted to thank you guys for tuning into this video. This is something that we typically do at this time of year in the kind of mid to late spring is do a college seminar. We invite people to come in, talk a little bit about the process, and I'm sure many of you have attended them in the past. We're doing this one over video this year for obvious reasons, and we're actually going to have two separate ones. One is going to be an underclassmen one, kind of geared toward younger players at the beginning stages of the process, and one geared toward upperclassmen who are maybe the later stages of the process. So this video is going to start with the underclass. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process and spend most of the time answering questions that you guys were kind enough to submit. Again, special thanks to all the people who wrote in with questions. We had a lot of good ones and hope to touch on many of the topics. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jimmy Moyle. I've been with Headfirst for the better part of the year. I'm kind of in a management role and coaching different teams, and been involved with the program for a number of years. I joined the management group full-time this summer, coming from college baseball, where I was a college coach for 12 years at 7 different colleges, ranging from Division 1, 2, 3, NAIA, and kind of different levels of private, public, different levels of academic selectivity and whatnot. So definitely a passion of mine is the recruiting process, and definitely happy to share some thoughts and answer some questions for you guys. So the first one I wanted to start off with, which was one I got from a number of families, was kind of at what age or grade should you reach out to college coaches? And I think there's kind of two questions in there. One is, when do you start really thinking about the process? And I think it's never really too late or never really too early to begin learning about college. And I think for kids even younger and at kind of the earlier stages of college baseball, or even the early stages of high school baseball, is thinking about what they want in a college academically, what they want socially, trying to figure out kind of where they fit baseball-wise, which is sometimes a bigger question and a little bit harder to answer for younger kids because they still have a lot of development ahead of them. For parents, especially thinking about the financial part, and it's really not too early to start that, even if you're, a 9th or 10th grader, even a little bit before that. But so really thinking about your criteria, and I kind of touched on the 4 criteria that we typically go off of. So when you're making a decision on college, you want to be thinking about the baseball component, you want to be thinking about the academic component, the social component, and the financial component, and trying to make sure that those 4 things match up, and it's kind of a good situation. You're not giving away too much on any one of those, because it's probably enough to make it a bad experience overall. At what grade or age I would recommend players reach out to coaches is a little bit, again, it can also vary. I would definitely say the fall of your senior year is, when you want to start, especially for 4-year colleges. It's not too late to do it in the second semester of your senior year, but it is getting late. For schools that are in Division 1, typically they start the recruiting process earlier, so they're probably in more of a mode of recruiting juniors, trying to finish recruiting seniors, and trying to learn about 8th grade, 9th grade, 10th grade players. So kids in those grades, it's a little bit more information gathering on the college's end, and that's an appropriate time to reach out. Other schools tend to do it a little bit later. So typically your Division 2, 3, NAIA community college schools, they're not necessarily out at games specifically to try to watch a kid who's a sophomore in high school very often. And so if you are younger and you're trying to make contact with schools outside of Division 1, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but also don't be offended if you don't get a response back right away, because typically those schools are trying to recruit kids who are seniors. Once they have their senior class committed, then they move on to the next group. So right now, Division 2 or 3 is probably trying to finish its 2020 class. Once that's done, let's say this summer at some point, then they shift their focus to a 2021. There's Division 1s that are a little bit ahead of that, and they're trying to finish 2021 and then trying to kind of recruit and gather information about 2022s, 2023s, etc. So again, it varies a lot school to school. There's not a bad time to reach out, but I think that there's situations where you may not get a response that you want right away, and something to just be kind of prepared for. The next thing, and I touched on that a little bit there in the last question, was at what, there are thousands of colleges that with baseball teams, how do I start narrowing my search? I think that really comes back to your criteria. I'm going to mention this a lot, but I think for players to think not only just about, am I a Division II or a Division I player or those kind of variables, but also what do you want academically and where do you profile, answering those types of questions. What's the financial piece is a very important part that you really can't be too prepared for. And then just even what do you want socially in a college? Do you want a big college, a little college, a city, a small town, a religious college, secular or public school, any of those types of variables. And, having those conversations for players and families at this stage, even when you are a little bit on the young side, is important, just so that you make a more educated decision down the road. The third question is, what are the differences in levels? And I think on a very structural level, the difference is a lot of time budgets and scholarships. In Division I, they're allowed 11.7 scholarships that can be divided amongst 27 players, and they can carry no more than 35 guys on the roster. Many of you have probably read that this next year that will change a little bit to kind of compensate for some of the players who lost the season due to the coronavirus, and probably will go back to normal after that, I think is the plan in Division I. But we'll see what happens with that. That's kind of still a moving target a little bit. Division II is allowed 9 scholarships with no roster cap, and there's no minimum scholarship you can get. Division III doesn't have any scholarships, and then community colleges in California also don't have scholarships. So that's kind of the main difference between levels on that. I think aside from focusing on levels, and a lot of players like to ask the question, where do I fit? Am I a Division I player? Am I a Division III player? Whatnot. I think you want to focus a little bit more on the specific program. So if you do identify some colleges that are a fit academically, financially, those kind of things, then you want to find out if you're a baseball fit. And part of that is communicating with their coaches. I think if it's possible, I always recommend players go watch practices and games, and just to try to use your own eyes to see, how you match up against those guys. I think that's very important. And you try to gather as many tools as you can in order to try to answer the question if you are a baseball fit or not. And so, typically speaking, Division I is going to be the biggest. Most of those schools are much larger than Division II or III. That's not an exclusive part of it, but originally when they started creating levels, it was based on school size, which is kind of closer to the way it works at the high school level, but that's getting 50, 60 years old now. So Division I's are going to be a little bit better funded than schools at other levels, and there's a little bit different rules in terms of how much they can practice and play. But other than that, I think schools are trying to all be competitive, and it's also worth noting that schools do not necessarily choose what level to be at based on baseball. And so there are programs that are probably much stronger, like the best Division III in the country is probably better than some Division IIs and some Division I's, and similar comparisons could be made across levels. I don't know that you could say the same thing about a lot of football or basketball at those levels. But again, that's where the decisions get made, is based on usually football and basketball. Baseball, it's a lot of other factors that wind up, kind of showing the strength of the program or not. So I think focus more on the school than the level is the best advice I could give. But thinking about levels and thinking about just like types of schools is not a bad way to start too, especially when you're younger and kind of thinking things a little bit more big picture and a few years out. What should go into an email to college coaches? I think that's a very good question. The main things I would put in the email, and I think this gets back to your criteria a little bit, and also knowing what they're going to be looking for too. So it's kind of knowing that a couple things is, one, you want to be able to say something about yourself baseball-wise and about yourself academically. So especially if those are really strong suits of yours, you want to say that really quickly. Many college recruiting coordinators and head coaches will get dozens, if not even 100 plus emails in a day. And so you want to make sure that the relevant information gets read. I always think anyone that's ever taken journalism or worked for a newspaper knows you put the most important information you can at the very beginning, because you assume that people won't necessarily read that far down. And so if you are a 4.0 who throws 90 miles an hour, like, you want that in the subject line, and you want that to be in the first paragraph, right? So that way, no one's going to miss that. So again, whatever you have for yourself academically, whatever your kind of strongest thing baseball-wise is that you can throw out there. And those are very relevant things to put very much at the front. Along the same lines with what you should include is something that also personalizes it a little bit to the school and to that specific program. Some coaches don't really like just the idea that you copy pasted the same email a million times, and even though you might have a template that you go off of, if you're saying something about why you're interested in their school, if it's a specific academic program, if it's a specific part of the social life, it's something about their baseball team, make sure you put that in there too. It doesn't necessarily need to be the first thing, it can be in the second or third paragraph, but it's something that you definitely want to include. And the last thing that you want to make sure you include is a link to a recruiting video. I think it's very important to have that, especially if the school is out of the area and they may not be able to see you play in person, as well as a list of references and their contact information. So, your coaches with Headfirst, if there's someone you do lessons with, a high school coach, those are the people that you want to include their information so that if the coach wants to follow up, they have that information available. That kind of leads us a little bit into the next two questions, which is what does the role of high school play in the recruiting process? And along that line, in my experience, when a college coach goes to watch a high school game, it's typically because they already know about the player. They've already cross-checked him. They already know he's going to get in academically. Like they kind of know everything they need to know. The question is just like exactly how good. So if we were looking at a player and saying, is he a 25% scholarship guy or a 50% scholarship guy? You go to a game to kind of answer that question, but he's at least one of those, right? It's not, college coaches don't typically just show up to a high school game and hope to find somebody that way. It's important to remember that college seasons and high school seasons are happening at the same time. So if a college coach is, playing Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, they're practicing some combination of Monday, Wednesday, they're maybe traveling on Thursday. There's just not a lot of time in the week to go watch other games. And so if you pull a coach out of practice or maybe miss pregame type stuff, it's usually got to be for an important recruit or an important situation for that. Where younger players especially, it's much more relevant is going to be the summer and the fall when college coaches don't have games. And so it's a lot easier to get out to big tournaments and big showcases and these things where you can go as a college coach and see, potentially hundreds of players in the same day. And that's going to be a lot more relevant than, going to one game where there might be one kid who may or may not even be good enough. So I think that's usually, as a college coach, that's a lot better bang for your buck, is going to those kind of big events during the summer and fall. Not that it doesn't happen that way at the high school level sometimes, but it's very hard to count on that as the way that you're going to get seen and recruited. At the same time, also wanted to talk a little bit about recruiting videos, and then we'll get into the difference with kind of the different big options, like I talked about, tournaments and showcases and those types of things. So the next question is about recruiting videos and kind of what, should you do it, how should it work and all that. I think it's very important to have a recruiting video, and like I said, it can be a very good tool, especially if you're looking at a college that may not be able to see you play in person, so someone outside the area, or even somebody that you just haven't been able to connect with in person, just giving something that's a reference for them. It's also important to know that a college coaching staff may have, somewhere between 3 and 7 people, and so even if someone sees you in person, having that visual thing that they can come back to even months later, they can forward to the other coaches in the office, especially if it's one of the coaches lower on the chain of command, and he can forward it to the recruiting coordinator and the head coach. That's an important thing to be able to have too. So he can say, hey, I saw this player and I liked him, here's his video, and that way the head coach can see it and have a reference point for that. Typically keep your recruiting videos fairly short, usually only a couple of minutes. And again, kind of back to that email rule about people don't want to watch a half an hour recruiting video. They're going to see a lot of those and have different amount of time that they're really willing to spend. Just George Athen, who works for Headfirst, and many of you know, does a great job making recruiting videos and has done it for a long time. So he can be a really good resource if you want to kind of have one done through that. The main things I would focus on is focus on your strengths. If your strength is hitting, make sure that you spend a lot of the video hitting. and hitting from some different angles. Usually a good angle is kind of right at you, so if I'm a right-handed hitter, setting up the camera like where the first base dugout would be is a good way to do that. To see mechanics, setting up behind the hitter if you're on a field so you can see ball flight. You can also put the camera forward and get an exit velocity. So again, kind of knowing a little bit of those things about yourself and trying to do that on the front end, I think, can be important. Same thing for a pitcher, having a radar gun in the shot, having the camera set off to your open side so you can see mechanics, having a radar gun and a camera angle behind the catcher is important, which is usually a better way to see movement on your off-speed pitches, and also the easiest way to see velocity on a radar gun there. Those are also good ways to do it too. So we can certainly talk more about recruiting videos another time. Like I said, George does a good job with that, and definitely, the person I'm going to follow up with if you're interested. The next question was about individual college camps compared to bigger showcases, and I get this one quite a lot, and a lot of people don't always understand the difference and the pros and cons to it too. So normally most of the ways that you can be seen by college coaches vary from a larger event where there are going to be multiple colleges, and one that's on a specific college campus where you're typically limited to that college, maybe one or two more, but usually it's just that one. And most colleges do host their own camp at some point. So my recommendation is for a player who's earlier in the process, and that's applicable to, again, the vast majority of the 9th and 10th graders and even some 11th graders that are watching this, is to go to a lot of the bigger events earlier on. If you're younger, you're less likely to really have your list narrowed down. You want to kind of maximize the number of people that see you and can kind of appreciate what you're doing, and going from there, you can kind of build those connections and start those relationships with coaches. The other benefit of ones that are technically considered camps is that the coaches can work the camps and be on the field. So like the showcases that we do with Headfirst are technically considered camps, where we can hire outside coaches to come work. They can interact with the players can ask them questions, and you can kind of build a relationship a little bit from that. I typically recommend players go to an individual college's camp when they're a little bit further along in the process. So for example, if you know you're going to get in, you've had some, or you're at least close, you've had some dialogue with the school, it's a fit, you've probably visited once before, and going to their camp is kind of that kind of dotting the I's, crossing the T's. It's also a really good way if you've dealt with a volunteer assistant or a director of operations or somebody that's maybe not quite the decision maker, and you want to make sure that you get to see and meet the head coach, and he gets to see and evaluate you, and that's an important thing for a lot of programs. But that's typically much later in the process that turns out to be a beneficial thing. If a school doesn't really know who you are in advance, going to their camp is not as relevant from a recruiting standpoint. I think if anything, at that point, maybe you're learning a little bit, and it can be a chance to work on some things and maybe pick up some pointers, but you're probably not as in a good position going to a camp like that without having had some dialogue and kind of being a little further in the process. So kind of summing that up, kind of the bigger events and trying to get seen by a lot of people up front is a really good way to start, with the individual college camp being something that comes a little bit later in the process. The next question we had was, how do I know what they are looking for academically and athletically? I think that's a very good question, and really where a lot of younger players are in the process are trying to figure out, what even should I be looking for? I know I want to go to college, I know I want to play baseball. What does that all mean? And so I think starting with coaches, and that's not a bad question to ask. One thing I forgot to mention in the email section was having some questions at the end to try to initiate some dialogue, and also just to ask about the process. A lot of these guys can be very helpful, and many of them also know that they might not be at the same college a couple years from now. It's another benefit for a younger player of going to a big camp and meeting a lot of coaches, is even if Coach X is at a school that is lower on your list or it's not a fit for whatever reason now, he may go to a different school and take the list with him, and you might be a recruit there. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I was a coach at a lot of different colleges, and there were certainly players that I saw at one college, and then I got another job, and I recruited them to the second college, and it worked out more than it didn't. So that wound up being a good thing. But I think for a lot of families and players, those relationships can be an important way to go. As far as the academically and athletically part, having that conversation about what are they looking for. Do they have certain metrics of GPA and SAT score that they want? Are there certain thresholds in terms of speed, velocity, exit velocity, things like that they're looking for that are kind of a baseline for them? And even without the numbers, just what things do they value in their program? Some programs really value a kid who can hit for power. Some programs really value or are looking for defense at a certain position. And there's not a right or wrong answer, but it is kind of good to ask them those questions, and I think that's very appropriate to do that directly. The bottom line is that colleges are looking for the best possible players they can. So there's not necessarily a secret formula. It's a lot of just they want really good players, and that's a good place to start. A lot of that kind of puts back onto the player about, hey, especially if you're younger, most players that are younger are, they need to get in the weight room, they need to get stronger, they need to throw harder, they need to run faster. All those types of things are a really good way for you to be working on things so that when you're in front of coaches, you are either what they want to see and you kind of are good enough at that point, or they can at least see you over a period of time and they can see you making progress toward what is good enough. I think that's kind of an important way to look at it as well. So the next question we had was, will there be any different criteria in terms of grades or academic issues that come out of the kind of the COVID-19 era? And that's going to be an interesting one. I think there's a lot of, and we actually made another video specifically about this, but this was a question I got as a follow-up to that, and we didn't necessarily talk about that much in that video. I don't know that colleges will necessarily look at that a lot differently. I could be wrong about this, but I think for most of them, they're going to want to see, again, they're going to want to see progress, right? They're going to want to see that you did your work in the classroom, and even if it was online and kind of different, they're going to want to see that wasn't necessarily a bad thing for you. A lot of colleges do look at progress. So even from an academic standpoint, if they see somebody as a marginal student as a freshman, they get better as a sophomore, they get better as a junior, they're a very strong student as a senior, even if their overall GPA isn't as strong, I think that is something that weighs into the process in different admissions departments, even though obviously different schools could take that into consideration differently. And especially as there are extenuating circumstances, again, that could be something that gets taken into consideration, but I also wouldn't necessarily count on that. So if you have an opportunity to really, use your time productively and bear down and get good grades and get stronger and all that stuff, take advantage of it. So really to sum up, the biggest message I'd want to leave you with, and especially for the underclassmen watching this video, is to really, use your time and be proactive. And what I mean by be proactive is don't necessarily wait for a college to recruit you, right? Do your homework on what you want in college, identify schools and programs that you think are a good fit, and then communicate with them. But don't necessarily be passive and reactive and wait for them to come to you. That's kind of they might come to you, but you don't necessarily want to count on that. At the same time, too, use your time wisely. Use your time to get your grades, to get your baseball skills and get everything like that in order right now. I mean, right now is kind of an interesting time, and a lot of the coaches I've talked to, that's been, when we kind of talked about, hey, how will this all affect, that's been almost a universal thing I've heard, is just some people will use this time really well to get ahead, to get better, and some people won't. And if you're kind of looking at it personally, you want to make sure that you're using this time to go the right direction so that, when you are playing in front of coaches, when you are getting looked at by admissions people, that you are your best possible self and you're putting that forward. So, definitely happy to chat with anybody else on an individual basis. If there's any questions that you guys have as follow-ups to this, or, if there's things that are a little bit more specific to your situation, we are going to be making an upper class video for this too, so certainly feel free to watch that as well. It's going to touch on some of the same topics, but a few different ones as well. So definitely thank you for your time, and this has been Jimmy Moyle with Headfirst Baseball. Thank you very much.